Alright guys, so yeah, we finally reached the breakthrough on page 50, part C, Italian Neorealism. And so yes, so Mussolini had this tight grip, but even though he had this tight grip, things were stirring. 42, 43, Mussolini is no more, and now the time is ripe for some sort of breakthrough. Let's read a little bit. We are on page 50. The time was ripe for the re-examination of the national conscience, and that re-evaluation of values upheld for centuries that were long due. If Italy was ready to seek her place in a continent that had been devastated by war, whose scars were everywhere to be seen, she must first give indication that she had reached a kind of moral maturity. Right? So after the war, the cinema could no longer be the same. It couldn't just be that sick, rotting culture that had arguably led Italy to the point where it found itself on the side of the Axis powers in World War II. They had to, cinema or all art had to kind of lead some sort of moral rejuvenation. Okay, so we drop to the next paragraph. The war was barely over when the first signs of this maturity blossomed, as miraculously as the broom flower blossoms in arid lands. It's a bit ridiculous, but okay. In 1945, Carlo Levi's Christ Stopped at Eboli and Roberto Rossellini's Open City made their appearance. And you, in particular, if you go onto YouTube and you check out some clips, you in particular want to check out Roberto Rossellini. We said there's a number of directors working within this movement of Italian neorealism, but the two, and it's unfair to the others, I suppose, but the two that you can really zero in on, the guys that you want to really check out the clip or two from, is Roberto Rossellini and it is Vittorio De Sisa. Those are the two guys that you really want to focus on. Then Open City is a very good one to check out. It has had a monumental impact on cinema. That they belonged to two different genres made little difference. What did matter was that they were the creations of artists who, liberated from a life without freedom, were now ready to express in a language which, for all its objectivity, managed to be eloquent. How much Italy had suffered in the disorder and violence that had been at the base of an intolerable way of life of 20 long, black years. Now we jump to the bottom, and this really captures it. In the words of Cesare Zavattini, a scenario writer who became one of the most articulate spokesmen of the new generation of cineasts, the true function of the cinema is not to tell fables. So this is super important, top of 51. You really have to kind of triple underline this. The true function of the cinema is not to tell fables. And to a true function, we must recall it. The cinema must tell a reality as if it were a story. The cinema must tell a reality as if it were a story. There must be no gap between life and what is on the screen. This poetics, so boldly stated, revolutionized the tradition that had been unquestionably accepted for centuries, injecting new life into it. So, a very different orientation than what we've seen in the past with the Italians. The turn was made inwards. We're going to start looking at ordinary people, and we're going to start telling their stories. For these guys, cinema is not about grand fables, grand constructions. It's about looking at the struggles of ordinary people and the moral difficulties we all face. Right, so this kind of philosophical turn, and it really, here, it's a good thing to write something like this is a philosophical orientation, right? It's a different philosophical orientation. It's a different modus operandi, right, that these guys have engendered. And it's going to lead to good things for them, in a sense. With this new conception of the role of cinema came new films and new visions. Italy was being re-explored and re-analyzed with an objectivity and lyricism that had been made possible only by the war and the suffering Italians had endured. And the interesting things there to note is that idea of re-exploration, reanalysis, right? The idea that you can cast the camera over a geographical landscape and tell a different story, tell a story in a different way. You can look at the same topic that's been done 1,000 times over, but if you come at it from a different philosophical orientation, you'll be able to reanalyze and re-explore and repurpose, right? The Italian artist learned not to fear confessing that he had been afraid, that he was poor and wretched, but that the economic poverty of his people would never prevent him from exploring the mystery of existence, the social and political injustices, present and past mistakes, so as to grow and help others grow. Right, and here's a few situations that he's going to mention, a few scenes from some of these films in the middle of 51, and this is the last thing we take from the Pachafici article. These are the sort of things that are going to happen in these films. Little facts. This is the sort of situations that would be explored in these films. Little facts. The meeting of a soldier and a girl in a liberated town. His falling in love with her, to find her the second time a prostitute, without his being aware that she is the same girl. The man who finds a job only to lose it when his bicycle is stolen from him. That's Bicycle Thief. That's Vittorio De Sisa's Bicycle Thief. I really suggest that you watch that. I've mentioned in Lecture 7, I think, that this is also the link to African filmmakers. This particular movie, Bicycle Thief by Vittorio De Sisa, it's a direct link to a 1963 film by Ousmane Sembène, the Senegalese filmmaker, the father of African cinema, as I mentioned last time out in Lecture 7. And his film Borom Saret, right? It's a direct link between Italian cinema and African cinema, or African critical cinema, should I say. The isolation and pathos of a retired teacher who is about to be thrown out of his apartment because he cannot meet the great increase in his rent. So look at this. It's these small stories, the stories of ordinary individuals, and it might not be surprising to us, but definitely to Italians back then who were just used to these movies glorifying the past, then with Mussolini glorifying the present, it was a massive shock. It was looking at ordinary people and saying, look at these ordinary people in these very difficult situations. And look also how when they get into these difficult situations, they don't always overcome those difficult situations, right? These and other little epic episodes of common daily Italian life became transformed in the magic hands of De Sisa, Zavattini, Rossellini, Visconti, and many other film directors into larger reflections of the boundless sorrows of mankind. That's the end of the Pachafici article. We're going to just do one more quickly. But I want to tell you, as we get into lecture 9 and 10 and so forth, as we get into a deeper exploration of the Italians, this is an interesting kind of historical and cultural take on Italian neorealism, but it gets far more technical and far more interesting and experimental and actually quite complicated. So we'll see that in future lectures. And one of the things that you want to say right now before we get into that more complexity is that one of the things that these guys are going to constantly do is play around with boundaries. So when you're watching an Italian neorealist film or a film inspired by it, as we said, their aim is to kind of confuse you a little bit, right? Remember, the Soviets, their aim was to shock you into action. For these guys, they are trying to get you into deep philosophical reflection. They're trying to confuse you a little bit, right? So when you're watching one of these films, you don't sometimes know when one shot begins and one shot ends. You sometimes don't know, is this a documentary? Is this a fiction? What precisely is this? Is this a person an actor, or are they just a person being filmed? They kind of play around with boundaries between reality and fiction. So that's something that you want to take note of as well for the future lectures before we get into that. Sorry, something's just popped up. Okay, so now we're going to just do one more thing, and this is a article. So check this out. Let me try to get this right. So we finished reading Pachafichi. We've got into page 51. We finished. Now we're going to turn the page, and there's one little page, one mini article I've taken. Well, it doesn't look so mini, but it is indeed. Just these 4 little pages. That's all we have to get through. This is Roberto and Wilson. And what we take from this article is just a little bit more information. It's in a sense, this is a very good summary of Italian neorealism. A very good basic summary of Italian neorealism. And they're going to give us some very useful points. So we're going to read from them, from this Roberta and Wilson article. And we start at the very, very top. Neorealism in film. It's on the top left, page 44. More than any one stylistic element, there is a certain attitude that best describes neorealism, especially in film. In circle, you want to make a big circle on attitude, right? It's about attitude. Or we called it a philosophical orientation or a philosophical inclination. It's about a certain attitude that's represented in film. That attitude or philosophical orientation includes a strong desire to uncover the truth about the widespread suffering in Italy and to identify with the plight of the victims. Neorealism also criticizes the view of society as a mere collection of individuals who condone indifference to others' suffering. According to Cesare Zavattini, you've heard that name already, the screenwriter for Fattore de Sisa and a chief theoretician of neorealism, many social problems persist because of a lack of awareness of the plight of others. So that's what these guys are trying to show, the plight of others, right? They have a social aim for their work. And that's why, by the way, these guys were taken on then by that third wave cinema. They were taken on by South American filmmakers, by African filmmakers, and so forth. Neorealism was to help overcome this barrier by showing how others live, suffer, and hope. So they want to look at ordinary people and what ordinary people get up to. Now we are kind of halfway on that same page, somewhere kind of dead in the middle, and Zavattini is going to come up again. When Cesare Zavattini was accused of being exclusively concerned with portraying a poverty and misery-stricken Italy, he replied, "We have started with misery simply because it is one of the most dominant aspects of our present society." Very interesting. Rossellini, when asked to define neorealism, called it an interior state, a way of feeling, a humble representation of the world, an act of courage that aspires to accept man as he is. What is common about all of the above descriptions of neorealism is the clear sense of a mission to enact a social as well as an aesthetic renewal in Italian culture. Another statement by Zavattini is revealing. To describe poverty is to protest against it. In fact, neorealism was a cinema of protest, of liberation not only from fascism but from injustice in general. Neorealist directors hoped that by identifying with victims of suffering and injustice, they could instill in the viewers a positive response, a movement toward reform. So definitely, this kind of filmmaking has a very strong social aspect to it. These guys are trying to make a statement. They are trying to make a social change. Right, let's take a look. top of page 45, very close, top of page to the end of lecture 8. Here's my daughter bashing on the door. Sabina. Top of page 45. Part of the vibrancy of the neorealist films may be explained by the fact that often the directors produce their own films on very limited budgets. Directors used cost-saving measures that actually had been recognized as a style of filmmaking, and we've talked about this in lecture 7. You can tick these all off. With the use of on-location shooting in authentic settings, non-professional actors, an emphasis on popular speech, so how people actually spoke, right? On the streets, street speech, if you want to say, a rejection of elaborate or contrived plots, frequent employment of improvisation, and a reliance on post-synchronous sound, a technique that would actually characterize much of post-war Italian production. Some of the neorealist techniques were developed out of necessity due to a lack of resources like functioning studios or even a steady supply of electricity. So all these things should also, and I remember I said this up front in the lecture, the idea of injustice all the way through to not having electricity should really remind us of our own country, of South Africa. Drop 4 lines down from where you were. By and large, the rough neorealist style was a well-planned reflection of both a serious social consciousness that wanted to tell the truth about the Italy in rags, an aesthetic ideal that turned ugliness into art. And that's an important part. You know, the Soviet films were quite draining and ugly and brutal. These films aren't ugly per se, they're actually very beautiful and very romantic films, but they take that which is ugly and kind of, they make it look really good. There's something very evocative about Italian neorealism. Right, so this combination, as I've just said, there's something very evocative about it. You'll see when you watch these films, when you watch a few clips or any film inspired by it, they produced films that were of great power and great beauty. The other thing that they often have, and we'll talk about this in lectures to come, so I won't talk about it now, but there's this idea of drifting. Okay, drifting and dislocation. So the main character often kind of drifts through the scenes. Much like life, right? You don't have this precise A to B to C kind of pathway, like we see in, for example, American movies. Somebody's moving through with determination and they will achieve what they want to achieve. The characters shown in these films are often drifting, dislocated, without agency. One final point, just so that we know this, just to, I suppose, sound impressive around the dinner table, page 55. So now you're dropping down to the second half of what I showed you, and just at the very top of page 55. So if you're looking at this as 4 squares in a sense, kind of dropping down towards the bottom square, over here, to the right. One other thing to say, and we're finishing up. In the post-war period, Italian culture came under the influence of the dictates of the Soviet Union, the Vatican, and the United States in popular and economic culture. So, the Italian neorealist story had to compete also with stories and cultural modes from the Soviet Union, from the United States, and of course from the Vatican. Right? So they didn't last long, they didn't last forever. There was a turn against this type of filmmaking. So it lasted, what, 8-9 years, and it started to die out. But it was a very important time, and it's had a massive impact on filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, and serious artists. Alright guys, so see you next time for lecture number 9.